Welcome back here to the Harlem Book Fair. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, Professor of African American Studies at Duke University, and I'm the moderator for the next panel. The panel is the New Urban Aesthetics, the Black Arts Movement, in which we're going to have a conversation to talk about the connections between the Black Arts Movement and what we see now as new forms of urban aesthetics. I'm joined to my right, to my colleague who is doing double duty today, Professor Imani Perry from Princeton University. To her right, we have Melissa Castillo-Garceau, who is the author of Pure Bronx, a book that she wrote with the historian Mark Naison. To her right, we have Mr. June Archer, who wrote the book, Yes, Everything Can Be a Good Thing. Next to him, we have Mr. Tramp Daly, The Adventures of the Untouchables, illustrator. And at the far end, we have Mr. Anthony Whyte, who published the book, A Love to Die, a piece of what some folks might describe as urban fiction or street fiction, and we'll talk about the complications of that as we go on this afternoon.
Thank you.
So one of the things that's interesting about this panel, there are any number of people, even in this room, as I sit here and look at Ms. Sonia Sanchez, who could describe what the Black Arts Movement was about, who were there in the room. What makes this panel unique is that none of us were in the room. And so it becomes an interesting vantage point to talk about what the legacy of the Black Arts Movement is for people who may not necessarily be engaged in the Black Arts Movement the way that we understand it historically, but have taken examples from the Black Arts Movement in their own work, both in terms of content, but also in terms of context, and also in terms of form. So one of the things I want to start with is to ask all of the panelists about what your sense is of the impact and the legacy of the Black Arts Movement on the work that you do as writers, illustrators, creative artists in general.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Anthony Whyte, and you know, back in the days, I met someone who was doing a show. Maybe some of you have seen the show or heard of it. It's called Zora Returns to Harlem. And the main character, Zora Neale Hurston, in that show was a good friend of Langston Hughes. And in doing her research, she told me one thing. She said, Anthony, you're writing hip-hop literature, which is great. But she said, did you know that Langston Hughes did jazz poetry? And that was news to me. So I researched it, and then I realized that jazz renaissance was big at the time that Langston Hughes was doing his thing here. And hip-hop music is big now that I'm doing my thing here. So there's some kind of correlation between his work and my work, historically speaking, that he used the music of the time, the rhythm, to forbear his words, to be the backdrop of his rhythm, of his lines, of his poetry. So in saying that, my dialogues are hip-hop, and meaning the iconic expression of rap is what I use for my character. So you'll hear, you know I'm saying, you know I'm doing, and you know it's colloquial, but it is communicative, and it's young, it's fresh, and it's like for the kids. And a lot of kids get into it, whereas their parents won't. So there's a correlation between jazz poetry and hip-hop literature, the rhythm.
I want to stay on that for a second, Anthony, because when you think about some of the Black Arts poets, whether we're talking about the late Amiri Baraka, Daly / Hakeem Aboudi, Professor Sonia Sanchez, they were all conscious of writing poetry that would resonate for young folks. I mean, Hakeem Aboudi's talking about writing poetry that literally you could hear on the dance floor. So some of the rhythms and the cadences of how the poems were written were calculated to be able to sonically connect with young people. And so that becomes an interesting kind of way. It almost reminds me of the way that the previous panel talked about these kind of black truths that we don't even know exist. And so we have these young hip hop artists right, that are tapping into finding ways sonically to connect with young folks who are tapping into much larger traditions. Your book, Pure Bronx, right, of course, is about the multicultural contemporary Bronx, right? And let's just own up to the fact of the Bronx being the home of hip hop, the boogie down, as we referred to when I was growing up in the Bronx. What does the Black arts movement look like in terms of a legacy in the Bronx, 40 years, 50 years after that moment that we all celebrate?
Yeah, I think for me, and in terms of writing the book, it's really an attention to vernacular. It's really an attention to hearing the streets, to being inspired by walking along streets, to listening to how conversations are formed, and to just really try and hear the everyday life. And that's really what we try to infuse. Dr. Naison, who is my co-author, he also started the Bronx African American Oral History Project. Right. So that was also really infused in terms of the way that we thought about the book, was really thinking about oral history. And for me, that's, the work of Sonia Sanchez, the work of, even before that, someone like Gwendolyn Brooks. It's really opening up your ears and listening to the community.
And I would suggest to everybody to take a chance to take a look at the work that Naison has been doing with this historical document, some of it of which is available on video now, and it is actually a great interview with the late historian Vincent Harding, who grew up in the Bronx, went to Morris High School in the Bronx, and has Bronx roots. For someone like yourself, Tramp, and you're working outside of a literary context. Again, this is a conversation that came up in an earlier panel.
Yes.
What does the Black arts aesthetic look like in terms of where you're working in terms of illustration and comics and what have you?
Well, I think Anthony touched on a real good point. I come from the world of graffiti, but I've started in the Source. When the Source first had a comic show, I did A View from the Underground, and it was creating characters, and I'm kind of known as like the hip-hop Disney. I have like 10,000 characters. So what he said about the rhythm from the blues era to the hip-hop era, when I write, me and him are also working on another lit book called The Badlands, The Love to Die For, where I wrote the script for it. So whether I'm writing or drawing, it's always to the rhythm of that. And I usually, of course, I'm going to aggregate a lot towards hip-hop from, I have Grandmaster Caz doing a voice over for one of the characters. I got DMC. And you can see the lineage of what they tell in the story. So, I would look at them as the poets or the writers that I'm really researching from probably late 70s when I was born to 80s, 90s, and so on. So I look at their stories, and one story that they write could grab me, control me, and then it makes me want to go and create the art. So cats will come up to me and be like, yo, that shit's fly. And when people come up to you and say that means they're really kind of saying yeah, I might want to buy that. And to me, when you're looking at that, we try to make the illustration speak for itself, so it has a literary form. So I had one page in the Source or one or two pages we did the comic strip, and Rakim came up to me one time and he was like, "You're the reason I get the Source," because I had 5%ers in there, and he was like, "Nobody's talking about us." And I was like, all right, word, but I did it because he wrote his rhymes. So I think the correlation for me was really to, you love a song, it grasps you and then motivates you. I think any art that motivates you to do the art that you want to do, that's transcendent. It kind of takes you that next level. So I think Harlem's the Mecca, you got the Bronx, and that fusion of that is really this, for us, it's the center point of the whole world. And that fusion comes from that, and we're like an extension of that. How graffiti came about, and then the characters from graffiti and so on.
What does the legacy of the Black arts movement look like for you, June?
Well, for me, because if we want to touch on the hip-hop aspect, for me, writing my book was a matter of breaking down barriers because it's so male-driven in hip-hop. One thing that we've gotten so far away from as men of color is saying that I love you to one another, to giving each other a hug. So in my book, I kind of create opportunities for us as young men and men of color to kind of break those barriers, to say it's okay to embrace your brother when you see him, even if it's for a long time and people are from a distance looking and saying, wow, he's holding him for a very long time, or he gave